Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. Nau mai, haere mai. Ko Rania Lani tōku ingoa. I'm a Service Engagement Manager at REANZ, the Research Education Advanced Network of New Zealand. I'm extremely lucky and honoured to chair and present our first keynote speaker of the NZRSE, Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru, whose career spans the past 28 years. Originally in the ICT industry with Māori property rights, he's been involved in as an advocate and a prominent for digital Māori rights, cultural appropriation, data sovereignty, digital colonialism, te reo Māori revitalisation with technology, Māori representation and intellectual property rights for the past 24 years. In more recent times, raising te kanga Māori and Mātauranga Māori awareness issues and academic research, focusing on Māori cultural rights with gene research. Dr. Taiuru will be presenting us today about Māori data sovereignty and introduction and implementation in the research sector. Nō reira e te rangatira Dr. Taiuru, nau mai whakatō mai ki NZRSE. Please welcome Dr. Taiuru to the stage.
Oh, kia ora e ngā mihi for that introduction. So, tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi nui ki a koutou mō te wiki o te reo Māori. So, I greet you all well for the Māori Language Week in New Zealand. It's a special week, and it's good to hear everybody practicing speaking te reo Māori. As my front screen here says, my prominent tribes I associate to is Ngāi Tahu, Ngāti Rāroa, and Ngāti Kahungunu. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this and also via Twitter or email. This is a little bit strange because I can't see anybody. All I can see is my presentation. So I feel like I'm just sitting here talking to myself. So without further ado. A lot of people ask why Māori data sovereignty. One of the key issues is that Māori and every other Indigenous peoples in the world, their property rights aren't recognised within the Western legal system. In New Zealand, we had a claim made for Māori intellectual property rights. That was over 20 years ago. And that claim was called Y262. Unfortunately, not much has happened with that claim. Hence, we are still arguing and fighting for intellectual property rights for Māori. So one way we talk about the issue of intellectual property rights is a famous Māori explorer, Kupe, discovered Aotearoa, New Zealand. So with him, he brought his traditions, Māori traditions, Polynesian traditions and values and laws. And that suited Māori quite well in New Zealand. And then Captain Cook arrived, bringing Western laws and Western ideas and ideologies. And so Captain Cook's law was all about individual property rights, as opposed to communal property rights and hierarchical community property rights that Aotearoa New Zealand once had. And hence lays the issue for Māori data sovereignty. Before speaking about Māori data sovereignty, it's important to understand what Māori data is. Now, this definition is lengthy, but it has been exercised and debated and fleshed out over the past 7 years. So essentially, it's important to identify what Māori data is, so you can then identify what a Māori data ecosystem is. And then it's also important to recognise that Māori data is of significant emotional, spiritual, economic, and intergenerational importance, or i.e. a taonga to Māori peoples, hapu or clans, tribes, iwi, and marae, traditional meeting houses. We consider that it's an intergenerational taonga, where we don't own the data, but we just merely protect it, what we call a kaitiaki. In New Zealand, we have a treaty with the Crown and Maori called Te Tiriti, and Te Tiriti or Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, it's important to remember that the Treaty of Waitangi gives Māori specific rights to their taonga. So data is a taonga. So when I say taonga, so taonga is a valuable, something very precious, extremely valuable. It can be both physical, or it can be something you can't see, intangible things as well. So for Māori, our traditional knowledge speaks about the origins of data and all knowledge of the world. So in a traditional Māori worldview, we have spirit worlds. Some people call them heavens, but I prefer the term spirit worlds. There's usually between 10 and 12 spirit worlds, depending on who your iwi is. And in the top spirit world was 3 baskets, which contained all the knowledge of the world, hence the data. So that was protected by a deity called Rehua. So Rehua sent a bird down to the earth. The bird is what we now call the huia bird, to talk to Tāne Mahuta to come up to the spirit world to get those 3 baskets of knowledge. So Tāne Mahuta did that and received the world's all the world's data. So this is where we say that all data has a whakapapa, or a genealogy, because it comes from Rehua to Tāne Mahuta. And there's various other stories where Tāne Mahuta was attacked by his brother Whiro, and it's where we different stories. This is how we relate traditional knowledge to hackers. In traditional Māori perspective, now all data has a modi, or a life force. Michael, who did the introduction this morning for this conference, spoke of the modi when he spoke about touching your head and your nose and breathing each other's breath, the modi. In traditional Māori perspective, every living natural object, or every natural object has a modi. So if I touch a tree, for example, that tree has a part of my modi, and I have a part of the tree's modi. So hence, we, from a traditional Māori perspective, data has a modi. We also know from a Western perspective that data is a commodity worth more than gold and oil. Hence, Māori data is a taonga because of its significant economic benefits. So as data is the new oil, and most business models are built around ownership of data, corporates are hoarding data and driving disparities across our societies to collect enough data to seek new knowledge in ways which we never believed possible before, such as health studies, targeted medicines, insurance, genetic modifications of humans and crops. Data is the key asset to improve efficiency in today's dynamic and competitive business environment. Now, in 2018, the former Chief Data Steward, in her data strategy and roadmap, stated that data is a taonga. Amongst other things, as you'll see here, were included 2 Māori values, Kaitiakitanga and Manaakitanga. This is quite important to understand that the New Zealand government in 2018 agreed data was a taonga. Unfortunately, the new Chief Data Steward hasn't said data is a taonga, or that it's not a taonga. But it's important that New Zealand recognises the importance and the value of Te Tiriti, or the Treaty of Waitangi, and that it establishes a partnership between Māori and the Crown. And this is where we need to consider data as a taonga. The United Nations also considers data as a taonga. As you can see here, the special rapporteur on the right to privacy is engaged with Indigenous data. The report identified that Indigenous peoples have inherent sovereignty over the data collected about them and about their resources. And that's clearly identified in paragraphs 52, 72, 73, and 75. And then again in the 2019 report, the Special Rapporteur on the Protection of the Use of Health-Related Data also identified several definitions of Indigenous data. Some of these instruments may not be too familiar to people outside of New Zealand. So I'm just going to briefly discuss what the four of them are and how they relate directly to Māori data sovereignty and to Māori data. So I'm just going to go screen by screen for each of these. So as I said before, in New Zealand we have a treaty, Te Tiriti or Waitangi. Now we have so basically Te Tiriti binds the Crown to these three principles of partnership, participation, and protection. Now, these principles are derived not just from the strict text of Te Tiriti, but it's also from the surrounding circumstances in which the agreement was entered into. These principles are not limited to these three principles, but also autonomy, active protection, options, mutual benefits, equity, equal treatment, and redress. So all three of these principles need to be considered when entering into partnerships with Māori peoples, whānau, hapu, iwi, and Māori organisations. It's also important to realise that Te Tiriti affords special rights to taonga by Māori. Now, if the chief data steward doesn't recognise data as a taonga, this opens up potential possibilities for Māori to go to the Waitangi tribunal to argue that data is a taonga, so we can ensure data sovereignty. Now, so Te Tiriti, I should have mentioned for our guests who aren't in New Zealand, that Te Tiriti was signed by a majority of chiefs of the tribes of New Zealand at the time. But He Whakaputanga was signed by a number of northern chiefs and basically declares, it contains 4 articles, and He Whakaputanga is only applicable to some far north iwi who didn't sign Te Tiriti. So basically, the 4 articles, Article 1 declares that New Zealand's an independent state with the chiefs of the United Tribes, and there's obligations. It provides obligations to the tribes, the hapu, and the whānau who are signatory to He Whakaputanga. This is where the principles of data sovereignty and the rights to exercise tikanga Māori and meaningful engagement with the Crown arise in Article 1. Article 2 declares that the chiefs are solely responsible for making new laws and governments, that no one else has the right to do so without permission of the chiefs who signed that. So this states that sovereign power is held by the chiefs in providing they have the right to continually practice their own Kaitiakitanga of Māori data, hence data sovereignty. The 3rd article provides a commitment for the chiefs to meet every year to discuss new laws and sovereignty issues. So Article 3 provides those tribes with protection of their own spiritual, cognitive, emotional, and physical assets, including their own data. The tribes could have protected their own tikanga with Māori data sovereignty had He Whakaputanga been more recognised. The final article of He Whakaputanga is basically an agreement from the King of England at the time, recognising a flag, and that the King of England is a parent to the infant state and will protect those chiefs. So in terms of data sovereignty, This article highlights the amicable relationship Māori was seeking with the Crown, and how in today's modern society, the trade and exploitation of Māori data wouldn't have occurred had the Crown recognised their commitment to he whakaputanga. I think all countries in the world, or most countries in the world now, part of the UN, have now committed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. While UNDRIP was created in 2007, New Zealand didn't ratify it until 2010. Then later, I understand Canada, Australia, and America also made commitments to UNDRIP. So basically, UNDRIP is a comprehensive international human rights document on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It sets out the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, well-being, and the rights of the world's Indigenous peoples. These articles on the screen all relate directly to Māori data sovereignty. Now, in New Zealand, we also have a Mātātua Declaration. Again, it relates specifically to a set of iwi in the Mātātua area of New Zealand. It was developed in 1993 as part of the United Nations International Year for the World's Indigenous Peoples. So the 9 tribes of Mātātua District and a number of other delegates, 150 delegates from around the world, came to Whakatane to discuss intellectual property rights. So again, the Mātātua Declaration is a critical piece of work in terms of cultural and intellectual property rights. So basically, the Mātātua Declaration states that Indigenous peoples are willing to share their knowledge with humanity, provided that their fundamental rights to define and control their knowledge is respected. Furthermore, that Indigenous peoples are not anti-science or anti-development, but they want the integrity of life and cultural knowledge to be respected. This statement allows for all sorts of data, research, and systems. So again, the Mātātua Declaration must be considered with Māori data sovereignty and data ecosystems that use Māori data. So what is Māori data? So in my opinion, there are 3 distinct versions of data sovereignty. Māori data sovereignty doesn't seem to fit into the standard data sovereignty nor Indigenous data sovereignty definitions. Firstly, data sovereignty is more about Western values and Western society. Indigenous data sovereignty is more related to nations, Indigenous nations, where Māori, we're not a nation. We don't have our own sovereign nation as such. We have a partnership with the Crown. So therefore, our partnership with the Crown is unique because the Crown and Māori have guaranteed the protection and obligations to work and to protect each other. And again, as I said earlier, the Treaty of Waitangi has an explicit statement giving Māori rights and self-governance to their taonga. So in terms of data sovereignty, there's these 7 principles of what Māori data sovereignty is. These are newish sort of principles that have developed over time. So traditionally, whakapapa means genealogy, but in terms of data sovereignty, it's called record keeping. So this means it's a responsibility for organisations that have Māori data and digital ecosystems that use Māori data to ensure that they recognise the system and the data as a taonga. Recognition that all data, whether it's digital or biological, identifiable or de-anonymised, has a whakapapa/genealogy and a mauri. It's a commitment to store accurate metadata to provide information about the provenance of the data for the purposes of its collection, and to identify where possible which whānau, hapu, iwi, marae, or other Māori organisation that data came from. A rangatiratanga, or authority. This is an acknowledgement that Māori whānau, hapu, iwi, marae, and Māori groups have inherent rights to exercise control or guardianship over Māori data and Māori data systems. It's also an obligation for organisations and Crown agencies to work together with Māori to ensure there's Māori in governance, and Māori are consulted at the very first stages of co-design of the data. It's also a commitment to store data in New Zealand where it's possible. Mātauranga Māori is usually Mātauranga Māori just usually refers to education or learning, but in terms of data sovereignty, I've classified it as cultural values. Now, this is a commitment to acknowledge and respect Māori knowledge systems and processes, and that they're not only a matter of courtesy, but also recognition that such knowledge can make a significant contribution to the design and implementation of and processes of data and ecosystems. Whakawhanaungatanga, or identity. This recognises that all data recognise that all data identifies benefits or the ability to empower Māori peoples, hapu, iwi, marae, and tino rangatira we shared with the relevant Māori and organisations. Among the tangible benefits that Māori peoples, hapu, marae, Māori groups, and iwi should be able to expect from a digital system project is that the provision of information is in a form that is useful and accessible to those stakeholders. Kotahitanga, or collective benefit, is the principle that recognising that data and their ecosystems will be designed and function in a way that enables Māori peoples, hapu, marae, Māori groups, and iwi to derive individual and collective benefit where possible, that the organisation that holds the data will endeavour to train and to help the Māori stakeholders create new systems and employment opportunities. The Manaakitanga, or care and consideration, is a commitment for the organisation to work with Māori stakeholders to ensure that systems do not generate bias against Māori peoples and groups. And if there are biases that are identified, that these will be addressed and used for positive outcomes. It's also a commitment to the UNDRIP free, prior and informed consent. And finally, the Kaitiakitanga principle is an acknowledgement that all Māori data is not owned by you. It's basically on loan to you for the long term as kaitiaki, or guardians. And that all data and systems will be subjected to Māori, tikanga Māori and principles. And that all data will be considered as a taonga. We often talk about the term Māori Data Sovereignty. It's my opinion that this term is a short-term solution, and that but it doesn't accurately reflect Māori society today. So pre-colonisation, Māori identify themselves in various ways. So as descendants or children of the sky, from the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, or of the deity of fertility, Tiki, or we'd identify ourselves from family names, clan names, tribe names. And then today, we also identify ourselves to marae, or traditional meeting houses, and to Māori organisations. So it's my belief that in the very near future, we're going to have whānau sovereignty, hapu sovereignty, iwi sovereignty, Māori sovereignty, Māori organisation sovereignty. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of push to use a social license for Māori data. I argue that a social license is basically just a digital tiranalis, the doctrine of discovery. So for me, the key issue here is that a social license contradicts all traditional principles of Māori cultural values and knowledge. So for a Crown agency to use a social license, you'd have to claim that you have the trust and support of whānau, hapu, iwi, marae, and Māori individuals, which obviously if they did, we wouldn't have the Waitangi Tribunal. So I don't recommend using a social license. So also using a social license implies that there has been significant consultation with Māori individuals and groups. But it's important to remember that there's not one authoritative Māori group who can speak on behalf of all Māori. It does require some consultation. A social license also ignores the independent sovereignty and self-governance in he whakaputanga and Te Tiriti. Open data is another term which is often used with Māori data. The argument I've heard is, well, it's, Māori have communal rights to property, why can't we have open data? But it's the same principles. In order to have open data, you need to assume that you have some sort of authority or right to own that data, yet you more than likely don't. So again, this is just another Western ownership model which is being forced around or forced upon Māori. So of course, the big question is, well, if open data and social licenses don't work, what's the options? So there's the following license, or Kaitiakitanga licenses. There's 5 that I've modified here. Were originally created by a Māori digital company, Te Hiku Media. So I've just modified the Kaitiakitanga licenses just slightly, so it can recognise Māori data sovereignty rights and the traditional ownership of the data. So the intention is that that these licenses can be modified and applied directly to any of the primary Māori societal groups, Māori, hapu, iwi, Māori groups. So there's 3 key aspects to a Kaitiakitanga license. So 1 and 2 addresses the issue of social licenses and open data, that Māori are the kaitiaki of the data, and that Western IP laws do not consider Māori rights and beliefs. Number 3 gives Māori a rangatiratanga, or a self-governance, as guaranteed in Te Tiriti, he whakaputanga, and the Mātātua Declaration, as well as UNDRIP. This is an intergenerational statement that allows for future generations to grow and manage our taonga. And 4 basically recognises the different societal groups in Māori. And it reinforces the fact that there's not one catch-all phase of, or one group to represent all Māori. So these licenses are on the link on the screen here, and they are being used by different practitioners. And again, I would suggest that once Y262 actually gets some weight and some decisions being made by the Crown, I believe that the Kaitiakitanga licenses will become meaningful and popular with Māori data. So some of the biggest questions I get asked is, well, we know you talk about Māori Data Sovereignty principles, you talk about definitions. What do we do? How do we do it? What do we do? So the first step as an organisation or a Crown agency is to actually make contact with the local Māori communities and arrange in-person meetings at a time that's convenient to them, noting this is probably going to be outside of business hours. At this stage, it's important to realise that as Māori, we're always being consulted, we're always being asked for our opinions about treaty obligations, about partnerships. But we all have jobs that we have to attend to and family commitments like everybody else. So it's important to make sure it's at a time suitable for the Māori community. Now, this original, meeting these people for the first time is the prime opportunity to bring your senior managers, governors, developers, and actually talk to the communities and actually find out what they want and how the data that you have can benefit that community. It's important to actually listen to these community people, share your vision and your ideas, and be really serious to form relationships and partnerships. This is the perfect time to start the co-design and invite one of their people to become a governor, or perhaps even if they've a developer, if they've got developers. It's also important to realise that a lot of our Māori communities aren't data or tech savvy. So ensuring that you speak a language that they understand is quite important. There's also a good opportunity to consider appointing a kaumātua to your data strategy. So a kaumātua is an elderly, highly respected, knowledgeable Māori person. There's a number of benefits to appointing a kaumātua. Basically, if the kaumātua gives you permission to do something, then you're not likely to have arguments with other parts of the community. It would usually be sorted out without any interaction with you. It's also, as I alluded to earlier on, it's really important to offer work experience, training, employment opportunities, and any aspirations of the organisation or the community that you're with. It's also becoming a new trend now to create commitment statements, Māori Data Sovereignty commitment statements to each of the legal instruments that we spoke of before. So basically for he whakaputanga, identifying all the 4 articles, and then actually stating how you will co-design and recognise each of those commitments. I suggest putting them on your website, making them part of your organisation's strategic values and strategies. But also noting that this he whakaputanga would only be relevant in parts of Auckland, parts of Hamilton, and the far north. A Te Tiriti commitment statement or a Treaty of Waitangi statement, again, that this should be interwoven throughout your whole organisation's principles and strategies. And it's important to work with the local iwi or Māori organisations. If there's no obvious local iwi, perhaps try and work with Māori organisations who share similar values to what you have and to what your data is about. And again, identifying the 3 principles, tino rangatiratanga. Basically self-governance. This is an ideal opportunity to commit a governor to a governance board, partnership, co-design, and ensuring that data is protected and there's no bias. For the UNDRIP commitment statement, I think it's important that you go through each of these 14 articles and clearly state how your organisation will commit to each of those. It's again these should all align with your organisation strategy. And so that was the end of my presentation, which it's a little bit, didn't take me quite as long as I thought it would. There's some extra readings here which I've collected. I'm assuming the presentation will be available somewhere for people to get, or it'll be on my website tonight, and just the references. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Taiuru. That was an amazing presentation. I'm sure we have learnt a lot from. If there are any questions, please feel free to write it in the little live Q&A. So if there's any pātai at all questions, Māori Week, please pop it in, and we'll give you guys a few seconds as well before we go over them. I can see one so far. So Alexandra writes, does the Treaty of Waitangi define, relatively to how it would be back then, what data is? Is there anything in the treaty that would help in nowadays discussions over definition of Māori data, which is, to my best of knowledge, is defined differently by different Māori stakeholders? Dr. Taiuru?
Sure. Okay. So if we remember that data is a taonga to Māori, because it has genealogy, it has Māori, and it's of significant value both economically in all aspects of society. So Te Tiriti clearly states taonga is protected under Te Tiriti. And the Waitangi Tribunal have identified and discussed what a taonga is. I could spend hours talking about what a taonga is, but it's important that we consider that data is a taonga, so then it is very applicable to Te Tiriti. But I take the point, data as we know it now didn't exist in 1840, but the treaty didn't define what a taonga was in 1840, and it didn't say today's taonga is applicable for the Te Tiriti, but tomorrow's taonga won't be. They didn't say that.
All right, awesome. Thank you for that. There's a few more questions popping up. So Clinton Roy writes, I would love a specific example of Māori data, what the restrictions are and what opportunities there are.
Okay, so probably, maybe if I talk about genetic data, just because it was in the media last week, genetic data of a taonga species. So the ownership of a taonga species, from a Māori perspective, you need to know where it came from. So this is the genealogy part. So if you took a kakapoa from, say, Banks Peninsula in Christchurch, then there's 6 hapu who have ownership rights over that, over the data. The implications are what you do with the data once you've sequenced the DNA and made it digital. We argue that you don't have the right to sequence the genome and put it on the internet as open data. You need to do that with consultation with those marae. And then during the sequencing and acquisition of the data of the taonga species, you should be working with the key stakeholders to figure out any benefits to the local communities, any cultural relevance around what you should do with that data, and the full prior informed consent of what will happen to that data once you put it on the internet. I have heard of an academic institution in New Zealand who wanted to digitise some historical texts, and they went to the marae, the local iwi, and they said, and the iwi were worried what would happen to that data, and the academic researcher said, it's okay, we're just going to put it on our server at the university, it's locked and private. And they failed to carry on and say what would happen once it went on the web server. So that was a repercussion, an issue of there.
Thank you. There's a few more questions popping up. So Yvette writes, do you have any comment on the development of traditional knowledge and biocultural labels?
I am aware of the biocultural labels. I guess, like anything, it's a work in progress, and I think more consultation's probably needed. But I think that's a good idea in principle, and I understand that they've been used widely in, I think, America and Canada. But again, I think some more work with traditional knowledge experts with academia would help.
Absolutely. Georgina Ray writes, thanks for a thought-provoking keynote and following with some actions that we can apply within our own organisations. Could you share any examples of research endeavours which are excelling in the space at the moment and what actions they are taking?
Okay, so I work at the Otago University Christchurch Heart Institute, and we've implemented a data sovereignty commitment, which should be it's not on our website today, but it will be. It's the lockdowns created some delays. So we've identified genetic data as a taonga, that any extracts of digital data as a taonga. We've made a number of cultural commitments to upskilling into Te Tiriti, UNDRIP. We've also identified or basically updated our major database to include iwi, so people can have anyone who provides a sample can identify as many iwi as they want. If it's more than 10, we can add them in. They can identify hapu, so we've created a new data sets of hapu and iwi, and data sets of marae. So in the future, our databases will be fully Māori data sovereignty compliant. We've also committed to engaging with our local Māori stakeholders, our iwi stakeholders, and we've been committed to once a month cultural upskilling of our organisation. The Institute's also appointed me to their governance group as a good Te Tiriti partner, and we've basically just got a full open and honest environment where there's no silly questions. You can practice te reo Māori in a safe place, and everyone's committed to moving forward in a positive manner. But at the same time, we've also had to admit that the systems used to be biased and society was biased. So we're on a big learning journey. And I believe that, if the Christchurch Heart Institute can do it, I believe anyone can do it because we're a very diverse group.
Awesome. Erin writes, are there any resources that define English scientific terms into Māori language? For example, definition or explanation of terms like bioinformatics, post-analysis, ? They would be very useful. They'd be very useful in community consultation.
Mm-hmm. So at the moment, the Indigenous Genomics Institute in New Zealand are looking at funding to do some of that work. I would suggest that engaging Māori communities with scientific terms, just using a translation of the term, is not always that simple. There's thousands of new Māori words, which it's almost impossible. It is impossible to keep up with what they are. I'd suggest using indigenising the way you think, or Māori as Māorification. Dr. Moana Jackson came up with the term Māorification, making the story or the what you're talking about applicable to Māori. So, for example, explaining what a genome is to someone who's not a scientist could be very difficult. So, from a Māori perspective, I say, well, a genome is basically your whakapapa. That's your genealogy. Everything that made you here today is a genome. It's your whakapapa. Then inside a marae, I use the analogy that the marae is a genome, and all the different parts of the marae that has all significant meanings to the Māori community. You can start talking about it being a genome. Likewise, if you're talking to Māori weavers, the helix is a symbol in Māori weaving with a whole story about genealogy and histories. So just trying to change the way you think when you engage with communities is probably better than just translations.
Thank you. There are lots of questions coming in. Keep them coming, guys. We've got lots of time. So I'm running, Emily writes, I am running an Endeavour program looking at flooding across Aotearoa. One aspect we are keen to explore is risk, so the effects of flooding on taonga. We are keen to provide the data for iwi and hapu in ways that they can assess. They can assess the risk to their taonga without us having access to their data at all, and are working with our hapu partner to work out the details. Do you think this is a good way of doing this? Do you have any suggestions? Ringamahi, Emily.
Yep, definitely. On the surface, it sounds very positive. And probably perhaps consider the Kaitiakitanga licenses. And also trying to more of a partnership with the hapu would be a good idea. It's not totally data sovereignty related, but usually with academics, and I've experienced it my whole life, that we have academics come in, they've got a project, they get your information, and then you never see them again, never heard of them, never hear from them again. So try and create genuine long-term relationships with Māori stakeholders. And if you do that, you might actually be surprised that you'll get a lot more information and a lot more help than just by being a short-term engagement.
Jorge writes, any practical considerations when Māori data and non-Māori data coexist at a research project?
Yep, so definitely co-governance, co-design, and the Māori data is still Māori data. But trying and your system will still be a Māori system. Any talk trying to say that it's not starts tending to be, getting into the realm of that racist blood quantum sort of exercise. So again, so it's important co-design, co-governance, and it might be that some parts of that Māori data should be treated differently or stored separately, depending on what kind of data you have. A classic example would be data about the living people who are living and people who are dead. From a Māori perspective, they should be separated out.
Eric writes, do you see any challenges with using public cloud providers such as Azure and AWS to host or analyze Māori data, even when they might have physical data centers in New Zealand?
Yep, definitely. So any organisation that's owned by an American company immediately comes under a number of laws in America. So that strips away data sovereignty rights, New Zealand privacy rights. So that's an issue. And ideally, cloud storage in New Zealand owned by a New Zealand company, but it's obviously not always possible, but it is definitely the gold standard.
Thank you. Simon writes, I'm curious how these principles interact with business terms of services. For example, as part of using your bank, you can give them permission to keep necessary data and records. A poor interpretation of these principles would suggest that each organization needs extensive consultation in order to have Māori clients, in order for them to keep the records necessary for their business. Surely this is not a helpful way to think of Māori data sovereignty. What would you suggest instead?
Sure. So I think, there is a level of practicality. Things like, your bank information. I don't think you can apply data sovereignty principles to every piece of data, but certainly if there's any data that can be that contains traditional knowledge, that can be used for positive outcomes, can be used for negative outcomes, could be biased, then I think you need to apply Māori data sovereignty principles. But certainly, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to. I think we have to be realistic that it's not all data should be considered or should have the principles applied.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taiuru. I'm going to wait a few seconds in case any more questions pop up. So feel free to go ahead and ask any questions, Pātai, if you guys have any, while we are still online. Just wait a few seconds. All right. I think that wraps up the session. So, nō reira e te rangatira, Dr. Taiuru, nā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you so much, Dr. Taiuru, and I'm sure everyone is virtually clapping for you at the moment for your time, and that was, the effort that you've put into that presentation. It was extremely insightful, particular to me as well, which I'm sure we can all come out learning and, something valuable that we've learned. We now have a 15-minute break followed by our last session. I think it's going to be a little bit more than 15 minutes now. So the last session and then some networking. So we'll see you guys at 4:15 p.m. Ka kite anō. Thank you so much.